Thank you so much for having me, and thank you all for being here as you sit at on your couches and dining room tables, and your animals and children are all running around, right? So interesting times we're living in. But as Piers mentioned, I'm Devon Powers. I'm a professor of advertising and public relations at Temple, and I'm going to talk to you today a little bit about my research on trends and just talking about this idea of hacking uncertainty and some of the thoughts that I've been having about thinking about the future kind of in this environment. So let me share my screen with you and my audio. So I've got my slideshow going. And there is my contact information, my email address, if you want to get in touch with me after the session. So I'll just start by saying we're obviously living in really tough times for all of us. There's a lot of uncertainty. The human brain doesn't like uncertainty, right? So even though there's reasons to feel uncertain at other times, right, in these moments of destabilization, we feel particularly uncertain. But I think that whenever we have a crisis, we also have an opportunity. We have an opportunity to reevaluate what matters to us, and I know a lot of us are doing that important work right now. We have an opportunity to think about our own drive and our own resilience and really kind of test our mettle. And I think that most of us, if not all of us, have a lot more strength than we sometimes give ourselves credit for when things are easy, and we see that at moments like now. It also allows us to reckon with the unknown honestly, because I think that the future is always unknown. It's just at moments like that you're in crisis, you start to recognize those unknowns and you start to feel them more. So I think that in that sense, we can think about these as opportunities to grow, to learn, to kind of reshape our priorities, and really think about the directions that we want to head once we're on surer footing. So what I'd like to share with you today are some tools that I use in my research, some tools that I teach my students about how to think about uncertainty and how to kind of prepare for the future. So as Piers mentioned, I wrote a book that came out last year. It's called On Trend, The Business of Forecasting the Future. In that book, I interviewed more than 70 people who work in innovation, trends, and futures research. So people who are at companies like PSFK and other companies that are in the United States and around the world. I also did some historical research about the sort of birth of the trends industry and trying to think about how we can take and harness those skills that industry and people who work in the innovation space really use so well, and use those skills to do in our everyday lives and in other kinds of sectors and spaces. So that's the spirit in which I teach my class. I'm teaching a class right now called Trends and the Future in Consumer Culture. It's a very wonderful class to be teaching at this moment because the students have really been introduced very, very much to how much preparing for the future really matters, how useful it is. I think it was useful at the beginning of the semester. It's especially useful now that now that we have reached this moment that we have. And what my students are doing is they're forecasting the future of various consumer sectors in the year 2030. So they're using some of these tools and tricks and critical thinking things that we'll talk about today to really think about how different sectors might look in the year 2030. So I'm going to give my headlines first, my takeaways first, so you're not left wanting where this is going. And I have three main points that I want to make today, and I'm going to march through them in order after I give them all to you. And those 3 points are as follows. The first is that trends are really a roadmap through uncertainty. So I'll explain what I mean by that in a moment. Second is that crisis accelerates trends. And the third point I want to make is that in order to hack uncertainty, what we need to do is embrace that acceleration and embrace those accelerating trends. So I'm going to talk through each of these now in turn, starting with what does it mean to think about a trend as a roadmap through uncertainty? So I think about trends as basically being glimpses into the future, right? They're the ways that activities and behaviors that are happening right now all around us are sending signals about the kinds of things they're going to grow. So I want to give an example of what I mean by this by showing you a video from late 2019. It's by the comedian Ronnie Chang, and some of you may have seen this. And let me just play this because this is a video that's really talking about the idea of convenience, but I think you'll hear some other things in it as well.
In America, never leave your house. Land of the free and land of never leaving your house. No item too trivial. No quantity too small. To be hand delivered into your home like an emperor. Anything. Anything in the world that comes to mind. Any fleeting thought you have while drunk. Anything. I want one pen. I want one. I don't want a box. I want just one pen. I want it in a box with some plastic. Throw some napkins in there. In another box. In a bigger box. 50 million boxes flying across America at all times. The airspace above America is just Amazon Prime. Packaging just knocking into each other like satellite debris, right? More Prime. Can't get enough Prime here. We need it Prime. We need Prime harder, faster, stronger. Faster Prime. Prime now.
What he's talking about there is how Amazon Prime is not convenient enough, and what people need is Prime now. And this idea that people want Amazon Prime to deliver one pen directly into their hands, because the idea is that Americans never leave their house, right? So I think that's a really interesting video, especially at this moment, right? Because that, you know, he didn't tell that joke yesterday. He told that joke at the end of 2019, several months before we found ourselves in this particular situation. And what I think that tells us is that this trend of convenience and of delivery, which we had been talking about for many years, which had been growing, already had other kinds of things and dynamics that were nested within it. Things like, you know, the sense of domesticity and people wanting to kind of cocoon themselves and kind of stay home and have things brought to them and kind of be around their loved ones or be in the most convenient space possible. So I think that brings us to the idea of what a trend is. And I think we can think about a trend in a couple of different ways, right? So first, having a little bit of problem here. Here we go. So first, that trends are cultural changes that reflect a culture's values and needs, right? So these changes happen, right? And they feel very bewildering and they seem to come out of nowhere, but they're always rooted in something that we need as people, something that we value, right? Something that we're looking to, and that is a fundamental sort of human interest and human need. Second, that trends start small and they grow over time. So we often see trends starting at the fringes, and we often see several waves of growth. So many of you are probably familiar with adoption curves, right? So the idea of innovators to early adopters to early majority and so on and so forth. But we also see trends grow and change and move over time, going from one sector of society to another sector of society, or sort of growing in these kind of concentric circles. As I've already alluded to, trends begin with innovators, right? And they travel through these patterns of social influence. And social influence can happen in a couple of different ways, right? It can happen through people mimicking what other people do, or businesses mimicking what other businesses do. But it can also happen through people responding to the same cultural forces with similar looking solutions. And trends tend to exist within and across sectors. So one of the things that I have my students do is I tell them that, you know, you may be doing, I have one group that's doing research on small businesses right now. I have another group that's doing research on fashion. And I say, you know, you may be looking at fashion, but fashion is not the only thing that matters to you. You need to also be thinking about health, and you need to be thinking about education. And you really want to be thinking across sectors in order to identify trends in a kind of full way. So this means that trends are visible everywhere. They're visible across sectors, as I've already pointed to, but they also manifest in lots of different kinds of media, in books, in magazines, in the news, in social media, right? We're gonna see them in terms of particular behaviors, in physical spaces, right? So you're going to see the similar kinds of trends manifesting and rooting in the same human needs and values across many different kinds of categories. So let me give you an example. And this is a photo that I took from Etsy a couple of weeks ago from a Lithuanian designer. And I want to, we all know that things have changed very quickly over the last couple of weeks. And I want to identify that I was looking at this probably in late February or early March. So before the conversation about face masks had kind of tipped in the United States the way we're seeing over the past couple of days. Before that was really common in Europe for people to kind of go out in masks. So I saw this picture and I thought it was super interesting. And I think that it identified a couple of things that masks are about that kind of get at the deeper trends behind this idea of masks. So the first one we can say is that masks seem to speak to a sense of anxiety, right? Of people wanting to protect themselves, hunker down, cover themselves, not be seen, go out into public in kind of a limited fashion. So that's one thing we can say. But we can also see masks as health, right? Masks as protecting a person's health, but also protecting and caring about the health of the greater community and the health of people around them. Masks are also, in this example, very clearly about fashion, right? So this is not, a paper mask that you might, get and throw away. This is something you would keep. This is something you could match an outfit with. This mask is relatively expensive. I think that this one's $55. So, the idea of masks as a fashion statement, which has been popular in Asia really since SARS, but is starting to move into the West. And then masks as a way of communicating one's community and their pro-sociality. So the idea that you wear a mask not just to protect yourself, but you wear a mask to protect your neighbor. And that masks become a way of being pro-social by sharing something that that everyone in your community needs. So there are really great stories that are coming out of, for instance, the Czech Republic, of people having sewing parties and hanging masks in public places for anyone to take, and that this becomes a real opportunity for people to share and care with the people around them. Masks are also exceptionally DIY. So this is sort of a craft mask from Etsy, but you also see people with sewing machines who are making masks at home, who are cutting up old fabric and doing these kinds of things on their own. So one of the signals that I see that's really important in here is the idea of community and the idea of self-sufficiency. And I think that goes way beyond masks, right? Masks are just one little tiny signal of a bigger trend of people kind of joining together and trying to find ways to serve themselves and be sufficient within themselves, but also use that self-sufficiency as a way to reach out to others. So that brings me to the question of how brands can participate in this to promote community and to promote self-sufficiency and to sort of help people help themselves and help other people as well, and recognize that we're all kind of linked together. And that's a beautiful thing, I think. I don't think that that's an anxious thing. I mean, it may have some anxiety in it somewhat, but I think it's also a really beautiful thing and a really nice thing. So this, I think, brings some really important questions to think about as consumers, as retailers, as brands, to think about where you want to be in the cycle of trends. Not every business or every person is going to be on that leading and cutting edge. Some people come in much later in these cycles. Some people want to be where the majority is, and some people want to be even a little bit later than that. But secondly, that anticipating trends becomes the strategy for hacking uncertainty, right? Understanding and trying to collect these signals, trying to think about them and level them up to layers of social meaning, and then using that as a way to think through some scenarios about where society might be heading or where a particular sector might be heading. So that's what I mean by trends, anticipating trends as a strategy for hacking uncertainty. So let me get to my second point, which is that crisis accelerates trends. So I think of crisis as putting the foot on the gas. I keep thinking these days about World War II and about all of the rights that, all of the things that were happening during that time, and how you saw really the birth of a really different consumer society that came up out of World War II. And I think we're in an interesting moment like that in terms of this acceleration. So I just want to give a couple of examples. So we think about what happened in the last decade with the Great Recession that was happening around 2008 and the rise of the gig economy, but what we used to call the sharing economy. And I think that that's really important. And I bring that up because the acceleration of trend that I think was happening there was you saw a lot of norms get broken. You saw a lot of sort of cracks exposed in this kind of social system, but you also saw things that were latent and that had already existed kind of accelerating and growing up through those cracks. So freelancing was already a thing. Social media was already a thing. There were already, people who were sort of doing their own businesses, being entrepreneurs, kind of breaking out of that long-term career mode into more protean ways of work. But during the Great Recession, you saw the rise of these particular companies that really set that kind of gig economy in motion in ways that we're all familiar with today. So I think we can think about this moment right now in a similar way. One example is what we see with the idea of delivery services, right? So here's a picture of Instacart. Just speaking personally, this is not a business that I'm not a grocery delivery person. I don't use HelloFresh. We don't use Instacart. That is not something that I had ever even contemplated before this moment. But I think a lot of consumers are like me and are thinking about sort of taking on potential services that they might not have done before. And we're seeing that kind of acceleration after we have broken some of those norms and people are kind of in a new, more exploratory kind of moment. So as I've already alluded to earlier, I think we see this acceleration of this DIY ethos with sewing machines and baking bread and doing things at home, trying to build new products or fix the things that you have and whatnot. And I think that that's a real, again, an opportunity to think about self-sufficiency, to think about supporting community, and to think about building ways to help sort of the consumer help themselves, and trying to link smaller businesses kind of into that story. But as I've already alluded to, right, acceleration means those cracks begin to show. And the example I want to bring here is the idea of what happened earlier this week with Amazon workers striking and Instacart workers striking. And what strikes me about this as very, very interesting is that it also exposes how much people are missing the other options of retail that exist and the other options for small businesses that exist, right? So this idea that, right now, maybe you need Amazon to bring certain things to you, but what you really want is to be able to go around the corner back to that little boutique or that little coffee shop and connect with that barista that you saw every morning and give that person a handshake and say, hey, welcome back. That's what we really want. And that's what people are really missing. So I think that acceleration, right, these cracks show, and we can think about ways in which we can fill those human needs for connection and for community and for helping people to help themselves. And that businesses really become those kind of pillars in this community. So when we think about this moment afterwards, those are the needs and wants that are going to be really pent up that people are going to be looking to satisfy. So just a couple more points before I'm done here, just a few more slides, that in order to hack uncertainty, right, we want to embrace those accelerating trends. And I have a couple of questions that I think are important to ask as we're looking to both find trends and answer the needs that they present. First is to figure out, as we're seeing the changes, what kind of patterns are existing among those changes, and trying to figure out how do we sort of start to knit those patterns together to tell us a story that we can insert ourselves into. We want to think about how fast-moving change can reflect true values that are at the core of our very being, right? And revealing those values allows us to answer, those needs that have emerged. We want to think about the kinds of things that are getting broken or the cracks that are being exposed in these fast-moving processes. And as I mentioned, I think Amazon and labor is a really, really big one. And it gives opportunities for other kinds of businesses in the aftermath to really show their distinction in terms of how they care about their employees. And we want to, this brings me to my last point, which is how do we plug those cracks to build new structures, right? To fill them in positive directions in the future. So again, I'm not sure if everybody's going to be able to see this last video. I am going to try to play it just for the last minute that I've got here. But this is a really, I think, very inspiring story that came out of my hometown of Philadelphia. So there are many florists in the city who had events that were canceled And because those events were canceled, they had flowers. And what you're seeing, what we've been seeing over the last couple of weeks is the florists are using those flowers to basically take Rittenhouse Square, which is a big public park in Philadelphia, and flower bomb it. And I think that that shows how you can take these true values and these real needs that people have and use them to kind of fill the cracks that are emerging. So let me show you this, this video again. I know it may not play for everyone, but if you're interested, you can search for Florists Flower Bomb Rittenhouse Square and you can watch it on your own.
Somebody just came up to me and said, listen, I came outside to get some fresh air. I had a headache. I sat down on the park bench. I walked around and looked at all the flowers. It made me very emotional and smile, and my headache's gone. So, I mean, the whole point of this was to just get everybody in kind of a positive outlook. I mean, we're going through a lot, all of us together. So anything that we can do that's positive and make everyone smile and cheer everyone up, that was the whole goal of this. Yesterday I had this thought. I was like, we have all of these coolers full of flowers. What do we do with them? We're just going to throw them out in the dumpster and nobody's going to be able to enjoy them. So I had a bunch of corporate events that canceled. I had some weddings that canceled. So I reached out to Carrie with Fabu Floral and we kind of partnered with this. I called all of the wholesalers around and I was like, listen, if you have anything, let's just go to Rittenhouse, let's do some installations and put a smile on everyone's faces because, I mean, we all need it right now.
So we arrived around 11 o'clock. We offloaded all of the trucks and the vans full of florals, foliages, supplies, and then we separated, you know, which florals that we wanted to work into the floral installations throughout the
So
park.
I'm just going to stop there because I know that I'm out of time, but I just think that video is so wonderful. And it really, again, I think speaks to this idea of tapping into true values and real needs and using what could potentially be seen as a loss as a win. And what a wonderful way to build a relationship, not just with the city, but with all of the people who are coming and seeing these flowers and meeting these florists and making that human connection. So I want to thank you for listening to me this afternoon. And if anybody has any questions, I think Piers is navigating that. But yeah, so the question is, are there trends that are going the other direction? For example, like trends that were accelerating before, but after COVID won't take off. Yeah, I mean, I think that there are, you know, as I sort of alluded to, I think anytime you have a crisis, you have a sort of pressure cooker, if you will, right? That's going to accelerate some of these nascent trends, and that's also going to maybe drive off and ward off some other trends. So the clearest example, the first thing that pops into mind with that is if you see some of the things that were going on with fashion. And I mentioned fashion not because, you know, we're talking about the design necessarily, but, you know, if you see some of the things that were going on with fashion with like lace and animal print and all of that kind of stuff that was speaking to a really kind of outlandish, sort of out there, forward, edgy consumer, what you're seeing now is a real retrenchment and a movement back to sort of comfort, security, and you're seeing it in clothes. And I mentioned that again, not because of the design per se, but because of the meanings that are behind that. So I do think you could say that, you know, that kind of every person out there for themselves, hyper individualistic moment that we were in, I think that that has sort of started to take a back seat, and that will have repercussions outside of fashion as well. You know, you can definitely think about how that might affect like influencer marketing. That's a really interesting sector to think about right now, obviously, you know, with people not going outside as much. But yeah, so yes, I absolutely think that there are possibilities of things getting dampened down too. But you know, the point of trends is to tap into, is to recognize that things are moving and changing all the time, and that even in moments of relative stasis, the future is always unknown. So I don't think that that's something to be afraid of necessarily that things may not take off. Again, I don't know if that's an answer to the question. Thank you for having me, peers, and thanks for everybody for coming.